Good afternoon, everyone. I welcome back to the post-noon session of iTech program, day 4. The topic of the talk will be carbon trade, tax, and other policies for climate change and mitigation. The talk will be delivered by Professor Kaveri A. Chitra. She is a faculty in School of Public Policy at IIT Delhi. She is also an associate with the Harvard Kennedy School's Benefer Center for Science and International Affairs and a fellow at Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy at School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins University. Her research area includes policy design and analysis, energy transition in developing countries, institutional analysis, modeling for policy analysis, electricity market design, decarbonizing electricity, mobility, and water, agriculture, energy nexus. With this, I will request Professor Kaveri to please start the talk.
Thanks a lot for that introduction. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Before I start my presentation, I was wondering if I could get a show of hands about how many of you are familiar with economics. Have you taken an economics course before or studied economics at some point? If yes, please raise your hand. Oh, I see. I see only one person. Okay. All right. Well, we'll start from the basics then. So the point of this discussion and this lecture will be to give you a basic introduction to carbon taxes, carbon trade, and such policies for climate change mitigation. Since I've been given only 1 hour, I'll keep it very short and keep the introductions pretty straightforward. But we'll also have a discussion on, under what conditions such policies work, what are the challenges with respect to implementing such policies and things like that. But before that, let me welcome all of you. It seems from your names, I can tell that it's a really diverse group of people. So welcome and thanks for joining this lecture. So let me start sharing my screen. If there's anything in particular that you'd like a discussion on related to this topic, we can also spare some time at the end to have that discussion. So feel free to write those topics in the chat if you like. All right, so can you see my screen?
Yes, ma'am, it is visible.
All right. Okay. So this is the outline of today's talk. We'll go through what does economic efficiency mean, an introduction to carbon tax, carbon trade, and applying it in the real world. So back in the late 1800s, Adam Smith came up with the idea that if individuals are allowed to seek their own self-interest, the system or society as a whole will end up achieving the best possible outcome. So this was the idea behind sort of the classical thinking of economics. But this would happen under these conditions, if there was perfect competition. And what does perfect competition mean? We'll get to that in a little more detail in the next slide, but we want a situation where there is basically the idea of perfect competition just means that you have a lot of participants who are competing with each other. And it's not so much, if you have very few participants, it's not sufficient competition. It could be other strategies involved. But if you have too many, if you have enough participants that no single participant can influence the outcome, that is a sign of perfect competition. Perfect information. Absence is something called externalities. Absence is something called public goods, and macroeconomic stability. Now, these are, for people who aren't introduced to ideas in economics, all of these might just be terms, but I'll go through some of them later. But the core of what we should understand here is that by allowing individual self-interest, the idea is that under certain conditions, we can achieve society's best interest. Perfect competition assumes that you have a large number of buyers and sellers, like I explained. You have identical products. So all these buyers and sellers are dealing with the same kind of products. No barriers to entry. Any new participant, either a buyer or seller, should be allowed to start buying and start selling without a barrier to entry. Now, can someone give me an example for, let's say we're thinking about investing in the housing, selling a house. What is the barrier to entry there? Anyone? I would appreciate some response, whether by text or, okay, so let's think of if you had to participate in the housing market, whether you had to buy or sell a house, what would a possible barrier to entry? If you had to be able to sell a house, what would your barrier of entry be? Or if you were to participate in the electricity market, what would your barrier to entry be? If you wanted to start selling electricity tomorrow, what would you need? Can you just start without anything?
Maybe I can attempt.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Sure. So one possible barrier would be the market price or the tariff.
Okay. To buying or selling?
Selling.
Selling, right. And
selling.
I see. Okay. Well, I was thinking of something along the lines of a large amount of capital. If you want to start selling electricity tomorrow, you need to be able to put in a lot of fixed cost, sort of a fixed amount of investment in order to be able to sell something. In the housing market, you need to be able to buy or have a house or some sort of asset to which you can use to. So it's not like anybody can join in the market and start selling it or start. So that is in a sense a barrier to entry. Perfect information is when everybody knows the value of so for instance, if you're participating in a used car market, then the idea of perfect information would mean if you were a buyer, you would know everything about the second-hand car that you are buying. But in reality, it's not possible to know. I mean, the seller might want to keep certain aspects of the used car secret. So in such situations, the buyer doesn't know how much to trust the seller or how much to value the product, right? So the idea of how much you are willing to, how much you can value either your whatever you buy or whatever you sell, for that you need perfect information. So this is what adds up to the idea of perfect competition. Now, let me also introduce you to some other basic concepts. These are what are known as demand and supply curves. The idea behind these curves is that it is a reflection of the idea that, so on the x-axis, you have quantity, and on the y-axis, you have price, right? And this is as you can see, it is a downward sloping curve. And the idea here is that as the demand or the quantity demanded increases, the willingness to pay reduces. So if, let's say, you're buying apples, for the first kilo, you might be willing to pay a lot of money, but for the second and every additional unit or a kilo of apples you might want to buy, you are likely to value it lesser and lesser, right? So that's the basic behavioral intuition behind the demand curve. Similarly, on the supply side, you have a positive slope. So this is the law of supply or the law of demand. So here, the idea is that this is a upward sloping curve because as the price increases, we assume that the cost of each quantity of product or service or good which is supplied, it is natural to assume that the more you supply, the more it costs, right? So for a producer, from the perspective of a producer, the more you supply, for every additional unit you supply, the cost will increase, right? So that is the intuition behind the law of supply. And the law of demand, as the quantity demanded increases, for every additional unit you would like, sorry? Did someone say something? With every additional unit you would like to buy, your willingness to pay, the value, the price that you're willing to buy it at will reduce. Is this somewhat clear? Does anyone have any questions at this point?
How the cost, the price decreases while the quantity is increasing on the first graph.
Yeah, so this is
side.
Right. This is not a reflection of the market cost, or not cost, the price. Let's say this is not a reflection of the price that you see in a market. It's a reflection of the idea of willingness to pay. But also, under certain conditions, you can extend it to the entire system. So now let's say I'm sorry, who was the person who asked the question? Abera. Yeah. The idea is simply that, Abera, if you were to buy a car or any items if you needed to buy something, right? How much are you willing to pay for that good? So if you're willing to buy a car, the first car is arguably more valuable to you than the second and third and fourth and fifth and sixth car. Between the sixth and seventh car, you just don't value it enough. Would you want to pay a lot of money to buy like a fifth car compared to how much you might want to buy for the first car? Does that make sense? Abera?
No, I don't need to add any extra money to buy the car.
Yeah, this is only a reflection of how much you value an additional the unit of a product or good. The idea is that all of us value the additional unit lesser as we have more and more. Does that make sense?
Clear, yeah.
And so the value of that curve reduces. Yeah. So the slope of the curve reduces. Okay. Right. And similar, so this is from the perspective of somebody who's demanding. So the consumer, this, and then this is from the perspective of a supplier. Now, if, and also if you have overall in any market, the more the demand, and if there is lesser supply, the price increases. Okay, but we should not go into that concept right now. Let's stick to the slides and stick to consumer and producer surplus. Okay, so the idea of consumer and producer surplus directly follows from what I just explained here. So how much each point on this curve is a point of how much you're willing to pay, the price you're willing to pay as a consumer for a certain quantity. Okay, so if the market price for a car is here, or an apple, let's say, is here, let's say your one apple costs $1, right? But for the first apple you're willing to pay, or the first, for the first apple you're willing to pay $2, let's assume. Okay, so the idea of a consumer surplus is the difference between the maximum willingness to pay and the actual, what you actually end up paying. That difference is assumed to be something that gives the consumer welfare, gives them some surplus, makes them happy because they were willing to pay a lot more, but they actually pay much lesser. So, and that changes with time. So since you value each marginal unit lesser with time, your consumer surplus also reduces, not over time, sorry, with every additional unit. Your consumer surplus also reduces as you have every additional unit. This triangle here is the total of the difference between the willingness to pay and what you actually pay. Similarly, for a producer, the producer surplus, can somebody tell me what the producer surplus is? Applying the same concept that we applied to the consumer surplus. So this line here represents the cost of a good at a quantity Q. So with every additional quantity Q, the cost for the producer increases because they have to produce more, right? So what does this, why is this the producer surplus? Now this is going to be an interactive talk, so I might call on people if I don't hear some sort of a response from somebody. Priyanka, if you don't mind, could you mute yourself unless you wanted to say something?
Sorry, Kaveri, I muted. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
Is there somebody who can answer what the producer surplus is? So similarly to the consumer surplus, it is what the producer, the difference between what it costs the producer to produce something and the price they are getting for the same product from the market. So is that clear? What they get from the market minus what it costs them. So that's the idea of how much they can earn extra beyond their cost. So that's what producer surplus is. The idea of a market is when your supply and demand curves interact, that is when you have maximum welfare. So this is a sort of extremely fundamental and important idea. What it basically says is that every consumer wants to consume only up to the point where their willingness to pay is higher than the cost of the product, right? So if their willingness to pay, let's say you're willing to pay for only, let's say the cost of an apple, the additional apple at this point is let's say it's $2, what the market is charging you for an apple, but you're willing to pay only 1.7 or something like that. And then at that point, you stop, right? Until your willingness to pay is higher than the cost of the product, you are actually willing to pay as a consumer. Similarly, the producer will only sell when the willingness to pay of the producer, when the cost for the producer is lower than what the consumer is paying for it. So this is very intuitive, right? But what it says is, at this point is the price that everybody will get, both the consumer and the producer. And this triangle here is a representation of how much welfare or surplus they are getting up to this point. If there are transactions are lesser than at this point, so let's say you have a queue here, what is the problem here? At this point, you're saying that there are consumers who could have bought a product for surplus, but they haven't. There are producers who could have sold a product and made more money, but they haven't. So then this doesn't make sense to have transactions below this point Q. But even above this point Q, people will not make transactions just because it doesn't make sense. It's either too expensive or they're not earning enough. So at this point where the supply and demand curves meet is when the society reaches optimal welfare. Now let's come to the idea of externalities or market failures. We understood earlier that market works, or perfect market works only under certain conditions. So when those certain conditions are not met, when there is market power or when there are too few buyers and sellers, or there are other aspects like economies of scale, where instead of the supply curve being, having an increasing slope, it has a decreasing slope, then you have something called a market failure. Other market failures, what is the biggest market failure that we are all talking about right now? And what is the COP, for instance, all about? Why is that a market failure? Right. Okay. The presence of externalities and the tragedy of commons, or when there's imperfect or asymmetric information, these are all additional market failures. Now, the presence of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is a negative, which is leading to a negative effect in the long run too, and in the short run as well, to human society, is the biggest example of an externality. And an externality results when the actions of one individual or firm have a direct and unintentional effect on the well-being of other individuals or profits of other firms. So a negative externality is air pollution, carbon emissions, oil spills. So here, when individuals or firms, they do things in their best interest. However, that has an effect that is uncompensated on somebody else, right? So you don't have their cost and how much benefit they're getting out of their actions is not accounted for in the market. So that's what it means when you have an externality. So an externality can be both negative or positive. A positive externality is when you have a clean air, or something you're doing, even though you're not valuing it, it has a positive effect on the well-being of other individuals, right? And so how do you represent this in economic terms? It's the difference between a private and a social value, either cost or benefit. So marginal cost and benefits in the presence of externalities. An example can be this one. So here earlier we discussed only two lines. We had a supply curve, which has a positive slope, and a demand curve. But the supply and demand curve were assumed to be those of private individuals. When you have when you have a private, when you have an externality, there might be a private cost, but the social cost is actually not reflected in the, if you only have private transactions. So that additional cost to society can be represented like this, where for every, let's say you're producing steel in this example, with every unit of steel production, it costs you certain amounts to produce steel, but it also has a cost of maybe health impacts or other sorts of costs on the society, which is not a direct cost on you, but it is a cost to the society. So that way you can represent a cost or an additional benefit or a reduced benefit in this way. Now, when you have such externalities, the assumption is that we started off with the assumption that markets give us the greatest benefit. But when you have externalities, then what do you do as a government? And so these are some tools at the government's disposal. Command and control, where the government just says, you know, each individual firm, you are only allowed to emit this much carbon. You have standards for technology. You're forcing each individual to do something that you think as a government, you think is correct, right? So those are command and control approaches. Other approaches could be information-based approaches, where you might be able to affect the behavior indirectly through provision of information. For example, in a lot of countries, you have these energy efficiency labels. I'm not sure in which of your countries you have them, but they are one way of saying, okay, when you're buying an air conditioner or you're buying some energy product, if there's some way of communicating that that product is highly efficient or less efficient, or emits a lot of carbon or emits less carbon or whatever, then that might have an effect on the buyer, right? And so what you're doing then is, you're not saying I'm going to value this through money, but you're saying just the fact that you're giving information might affect behavior. So the assumption here is that money is not the only factor, but there are other factors, which to a non-economist sounds very simple and easy, but to economists, a classical economics theory starts with the assumption that markets are the best solution to organize society. So, so this is information is like a tool outside the market. It helps improve, like for instance, we discussed the idea of perfect information in a perfect market. So giving information might improve behavior and how much different market participants value that a certain product or good based on better information. Other ways to resolve externalities are market-based ways. So this is where you impose a monetary value somehow through taxes or trading. And we'll discuss taxes and trade in a little more detail. What is a tax? The idea of a tax is that you internalize the externality through a value, through a cost, right? So you force producers and consumers to incorporate the full cost of their actions into their decisions. So let's go back to this figure. What are we seeing here? From this figure, what can you tell me about the difference between, what can you tell me about how much we should tax a steel producer to be able to incorporate the externality of the production of steel? Okay, let me call on someone. How about Delini Fernando?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so what do you think, how much should the tax be if you were a regulator and you wanted to make sure that the externalities or the pollution, environmental effects of production of steel, you wanted to make sure that it is incorporated in the value of steel? Then how much would you tax a steel producer from this figure?
The amount from the C to D?
Exactly, perfect. And why is that so?
Because the bottom curve is without the externalities.
Yeah.
And the upper curve is with the social cost, which means it is including the externality cost. So on the top curve, the demand curve crosses point C. So that is the equilibrium point.
Okay.
That difference is the tax.
Great, thank you so much. And so here, so that is one way of setting a tax is one way of regulating a good or a market, a good for or a market for a certain good. The other tool that economists have at their disposal is to set the quantity. Now, this is viewed as, it can be viewed as filling in a missing demand curve. It can be viewed as converting a public good into a private one. Now, here earlier, in the earlier figures, we were talking, the supply and demand curves were representing the supply and demand for a good or the product or service. This particular figure, the supply and demand curves are representing the supply and demand for abatement of whatever pollution. So let's take carbon emissions, right? So this demand curve is the marginal benefit, the additional benefit you get by abating or by reducing, sorry, let's use the word abatement, by abating your carbon emissions. And this supply curve is the additional cost of abating your carbon emissions, right? So that is, so let's be clear that this figure is like a market for that externality, right? Market for abating that externality. So when you have any market, the two primary direct tools you have to intervene in the market are either by setting the price, or which is this tax, or by setting the quantity. Okay, and where do you need to set this quantity and price? You need to set it at the optimal point. The optimal point is the point where, like any market, your additional benefit is equal to the additional cost of buying of that good or service or product, and in this case of abatement, right? So you are this point is the optimal point that at which you want to reduce carbon or you want to abate carbon emissions. That at that point, the cost of abating carbon emissions equals the benefit from abating carbon emissions. Okay. So carbon emissions, as we discussed, is like an externality. It is not accounted for in the market. So if you wanted to set a quantity for carbon emissions, how would you do it? One way of doing it is to, it is currently, it has the properties of a public good. Meaning that it is non-excludable and non-rivalrous. And so when somebody emits carbon, it doesn't mean that, or when somebody abates carbon, you can't say that the carbon for somebody else is also reduced. So actually, I think what I meant was, when you reduce, it is, if you do reduce carbon, the value of that carbon reduction is not just for you, it is for everybody else as well. So it is non-excludable. The value of reducing carbon is not something that you can keep to yourself, but it's for everyone, right? So you can't exclude others from getting value. So that is one property of a public good. But is there a way to make that public good private? Can you have that value for yourself? And one way of doing that is by allowing you to trade carbon, right? So that is one way of looking at how cap and trade works. So you're making a public good, adding a value to it, and saying you can privatize this public good, so you have an incentive to get value out of it, right? And if how do you know, is a tax equivalent to a quantity, a regulation by tax equivalent to a regulation by quantity? It can be if the abatement cost curves are known. So if you know exactly what it takes to abate the cost, how much cost it takes to abate carbon, and you know exactly how much it has to be valued, the benefit of abating carbon, then if you know it with certainty, then you can say that the cost at which you are setting your taxes will lead to the exact corresponding amount of carbon that is abated, right? So you can either abate by price or by quantity if there is certainty about the costs and benefits. Now, does anyone have any idea of how certain we are about the costs and benefits of abating carbon? Gabrielle. Or Sergio? Sergio Imanya. I wonder if anyone's listening to me at all. Anyway, anybody else wants to respond? Paola, Hafiz. Okay. All right. Let's just move on then. Why are market-based policies useful? Why are they better than a command and control policy? So to answer this, let's look at an example. Assume that we have two firms and each firm emits 150 tons of pollution, okay? And if you were a regulator, you're supposed to cut those emissions by 2/3. So together, you must achieve 100 tons of abatement. So each of these firms abate only 50 tons together, right? So again, in the absence of regulation, these two firms together are emitting 150 tons of pollution, all right? But we want to cut that to 100 tons of pollution, which means that these firms together are allowed to emit only 50 tons, okay? Now, if you were to use a command and control method, the easy way of thinking about it is to say, okay, both firms, let's be fair, and say both firms need to cut it by half. So this is the command and control method. You'll say, each firm should achieve, let's say, 50 tons of abatement because you want to achieve 100 in total. Does this make sense or not? Let's think about it. The key here is to see how much it costs each firm to abate. All right. So this curve, let's follow this curve here. This one represents the cost of abatement for the firm A. Okay. And in the opposite direction, you have the cost of abatement for firm B. On the x-axis, you have abatement. Again, like quantity, like in all supply-demand curves. And on the y-axis, you have dollars per ton, which is the cost of abatement, right? So here, if you have abatement by firm, if you have, what you should notice or remember clearly in this graph is that at any point on the x-axis, at any point here, the total amount of abatement equals 100 units. Okay, so that is the amount by which you are required to achieve abatement. So if we take this point here, that means abatement by firm A is about 40 units and abatement by firm B is about 60 units. Okay. Now, let's take the assumption of command and control. If you made each firm abate 50 units each, then the cost for the total cost for firm A to make that abatement is the area given by small letter A. The total cost of abatement for firm B is the area given by small letter B plus the area given by small letter C, because the cost of abatement is here, right? So this then is the total cost. The shaded region A plus B plus C is the total cost of abatement when you have a command and control policy where each one is required to abate 50 units. However, from this graph, which is the optimal, at what point can you tell me is the optimal amount of abatement by firm A and firm B? Delini, do you have any idea?
Should be at the B point, simple B.
Exactly. Why?
Because if you go with the other way, the firm B will have to incur a higher cost.
Yeah, exactly. So, so when you have differences in marginal abatement costs of firms, it is very difficult for the regulator to know how much exactly it costs whom. But you want them to reduce their emissions in the most cost-effective way without knowing exactly what their costs are. So then, market instruments allow you to make that happen, either through taxes or through trade. And like Delaney said, it is at this point B, which is the optimal abatement. So when firm A abates up to the point 60 and firm B abates up to the point 40, you get the least cost abatement, the optimal abatement. So this way, market-based policies are more cost-effective than command and control policies. They enable the firm with the lowest marginal cost of abatement to abate first. And not just that, they are also more likely to provide stronger incentives for the development of new pollution control technologies. So if you know that the value is, so for instance here, it is clear that the firm B has a higher cost of abatement, right? So if he wants to reduce that cost of abatement, and if there is a value to that abatement, if the value is high enough, the incentive for these firms to find out ways to reduce their costs of abatement will be higher. So you don't, as a regulator, you don't have to tell the firms how to reduce their emissions. Instead, you just give them the incentives which allow them reduce emissions. Now let's go into a little more detail on how tax and trade works. A tax is, as I explained, internalizing the externality. It forces consumers and producers to incorporate the full cost of their externalities. And how does it do it? Now, let's say the tax is set at the value, the optimal abatement value, right? So we somehow figure out that X dash here at this point is the optimal abatement. And this is the corresponding tax. Now, for a firm, how does a tax influence a firm's incentives? Now, if the cost of abatement, this marginal cost curve here represents the cost of abatement for that firm. Now, the firm has to pay a tax of, at this point, let's say here, if he's if the firm is abating a value or a quantity lesser than X dash, then the cost of that abatement is lesser than the tax he will have to pay, right? So it makes sense for him to abate more because he will have to his cost at this point is still lower than his tax. So this changes only when the cost of his abatement is, so he will abate up to the point where the tax is lower than the cost of his abatement. So so that is the idea behind how each firm changes its behavior So each firm is better off abating up to the point where the cost of abatement for him equals the tax. Beyond that, it doesn't make sense for him to reduce his abatement. Because the cost of abatement is higher than what he is required to pay for the amount he is abating, right? Now, if a regulator needs to design a tax, what do they need to know? They need to know the aggregate industry level marginal abatement curve. So they need to know not just the costs of abatement of each firm, but they need, or even if they don't know the cost of abatement of each firm, they need to be able to figure out the cost of abatement for the entire industry, whether it's energy or steel or whatever. And so that's the information the regulator needs in order to say at a certain tax, you will get a reduced amount of this much amount of emissions are reduced. Before I go into the real world considerations, let me quickly go over cap and trade also. Negative external, as I explained earlier, the idea of a cap and trade or setting, this is where you set a quantity, right? This it can be seen as where you're privatizing a public good, right? A non-rival, non-excludable public good into a collection of private good or allowances. And for creating or for setting a quantity, for setting a cap and trade mechanism, you need to know a demand curve or the marginal benefit curve. How does this work? Now let's go back to this figure where you have two firms which have different abatement costs. If we set a cap that each firm or the firms together are allowed to emit only 50 tons of carbon out of the 150 tons that they both would have emitted in the absence of regulation. So now let's say they both together are required to emit only 100 tons. Sorry, they are required to abate only 100 tons, which means that they are allowed to emit 50 tons. Now, so the 50 tons is what is being privatized, okay? And how we do that is by setting allowances. Each firm, let's say in a command and control situation, each firm is allowed to emit only 25 tons, okay? But if you allow them to trade those 25 tons between each other, what happens? So in the absence of any regulation, each firm would have emitted maybe around 75 tons, let's assume, okay? But now that you have, you can only emit 50, sorry. Now that you can only get 50 tons, so you can only emit 25 tons, each firm can only emit 25 tons, you are required to abate 50 tons. Let's assume under the command and control situation, you're required to abate only 50 tons. So if you're required to abate only 50 tons, you have this situation that we had earlier, right? Where the cost of abatement for everyone is different. Now, if you allow them to trade between themselves at 50 tons for each firm, firm A is the marginal cost of abatement for firm A at that point is 100 tons. The marginal cost of abatement for firm B is 150 tons. Now, if firm A can, what can firm B do here? if firm B is willing to pay firm A 150 tons to buy an allowance, and firm, because for them, anything getting the right to emit, which is at a cost lower than their abatement cost, is a benefit for firm B, right? So but on the other hand, for firm A, for them, getting a value that is higher than their cost of abatement is a benefit, right? So if these two guys trade, they will trade because for each A and B, it makes more sense to, for B, it makes more sense to buy abatement allowances from, or sorry, for firm B, it makes sense to sell his allowance for a cost lesser than 150. And for firm A, it makes sense to buy an allowance. Firm B is, it makes more sense to buy an allowance for a cost lesser than 150. And for firm A, it makes sense to sell his allowance up to this point B. So that's how there is incentive for, that's how the idea of trading allows the most efficient, optimal, cost-effective outcome. Now, in the last 3 minutes that we have, let's try and think about how we can apply this to the real world. What are the problems with setting a cap and trade mechanism? Does it work? Has it worked? What are the problems with taxes? What might work and what might not work? Any thoughts? You all might have some experience with, reading from the newspapers that Europe is introducing carbon taxes or a cap and trade mechanism. The Kyoto Protocol was also one way of implementing the cap and trade mechanism. From this basic introduction to taxes and cap and trade, what do you think is, why is it hard to implement these? Any idea?
So, ma'am, if I may go through.
Yes, please.
I think one of the biggest hurdles is a declaration of emission by individual companies. So
right.
Half the time they might declare less than the actual emission.
Yeah. And so what does the government need if they wanted to find out how much exactly is being emitted? They would need to invest in, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, they would need to invest in appropriate metering technologies placed on the point of emissions.
Absolutely, and that's a huge cost to the government. Indeed, you need information about how much each individual firm is emitting. What are other issues? So that's an issue with cap and trade. What is the biggest issue with setting a carbon tax?
Tax doesn't allow to reduce the emission, like it's just a cost for them,
yeah.
But it will reduce the amount of emissions for some extent, but it will not reach our goals.
Yeah, and why? Why do you think that is? If can we tax at a higher level to reach our goals?
So maybe if I may go through.
Yes, please.
I think for major multinationals, it's profitable for them to pay whatever tax is levied against them because they can afford it.
Yeah.
Against cutting back on production.
Right. But do you think the taxes are set at the right level? Do you think we know what the value of a benefit from abating tax is? So if we wanted, let's say, to get this, we wanted to get to this point, this optimal point, we need to know the benefit curve also, not just the cost curve, right? And that's where we set the tax. Can we do we know enough to be able to say this is the benefit from not emitting carbon? Can we value that in rupees or dollars or euros or whatever currency?
Well, in my experience and observation, I think that's the same line you're going through, ma'am. I think it's very difficult to actualize the benefit cost, and maybe with time to come, more multinationals are institutionalizing the benefits, but the actual cost attached to it, I've not really observed it unless I am misplaced.
Absolutely, absolutely. Abera, you wanted to just say something?
I think, as my friend says, there is no metering mechanism of these values, but we are simply trying to reduce the emission by having some renewable energy and other, but we are not able to have some values for this reducing of these emissions currently. If we have that, we can come to these graphs like the benefit that we get from reducing and to relate with tax.
Yeah, absolutely. Another huge problem associated with the idea of implementing a cap and trade or a tax mechanism is that there is a significant time lag between when we emit and which generation feels the cost of emitting that carbon, right? So that is, how can we value costs and benefits across time? And I think that is also an idea that we haven't fully we haven't figured out yet. So if we value future generations' costs as highly as we do current generations' costs, then the benefit or the marginal benefit curve would look very different. So there's a huge range of uncertainty for exactly what the marginal benefit curve should look like. And this concept is called the social cost of carbon. And nobody has really been able to come up with, every year we have newer estimates for what the social and cost of carbon will be. And each of those estimates are higher than what was presented in the previous year. So that's interesting. If you just go look at the social cost of carbon, look for the social cost of carbon and see what the latest is, you'll see how much uncertainty is associated with it and how big it is. It's increasing. So these are very hard to do and hard to implement in the real world. Although when implemented properly, under certain conditions, they can yield results, and they might be better than under certain conditions. They might help. For example, in Europe, they actually helped to regulate emissions over time. So that's it for this class. I don't want to take up your break, and we can meet again in about half an hour when we'll discuss something about electricity markets and renewable integration. Thanks to those who engaged with me, and I hope the others were also enjoyed listening to the course. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mark. You too.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
I request all, we'll be resuming the session at 3:30 p.m. So I request all to please join at that time. Thank you.